Well, hey everybody, welcome to Preservice Chat. It's great to have Kim with us this morning. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, good to be here.
Kim, we talk a lot at SBC about the power of story.
Mm-hmm.
You have been very willing to open up your life to us, and at various points have shared some of your story. We have these little CDs here that we've heard a little bit about, Lost at Sea. Hey, maybe just explain a little bit of what's going on right now, how you're sharing the story, and some of the stories that have spun out of.
Yeah. Ooh, there's a lot of those, I feel like.
Yeah.
So maybe for those of you who don't know my story or have missed it or you're just tuning in now. Back in 2014, I lost my first husband suddenly to a genetic disorder that we didn't know about. And so out of my grief process, being a musician and a songwriter, I did a lot of my processing of my own journey and my story through writing an album, and just kind of this metaphor of shipwreck just seemed to really resonate with my own journey of just everything that I was going through, and so poured that all into this album. And now like 7 years. It's really interesting. Steve in a sermon last week talked about the number 7.
Oh, right.
And how numbers have all these meanings, and the number 7 is a number that often means like completion. And so it was really fitting that we released this album 7 years after he passed away on the 7th of September. And so some really interesting numerical meanings there if that interests you. But it's been really interesting sharing this with people who are experiencing their own grief, and just hearing people resonate with this story. And I met one lady that shared that she had actually lost her husband at sea. He was a sailor, an experienced sailor, and got blown away in something, and they just never found his body. And just the way that she resonated, and especially her own journey with God through that season was really just, it was an encouraging, it's cool to hear your own story echoed in other people's stories, and to come together and be like, wow, like so many similarities, so many differences too, but especially in God's faithfulness, so many similarities, and just how encouraging that can be, and inspiring and hopeful that all can be.
Well, as you were, we've talked about this numerous times, obviously. When you were talking earlier, and you talked about how, in your processing was the writing and the music aspect, and it just hit me when you said that. That's been something that we have used as a church for 2,000 years, going into the Psalms.
Totally.
Which were what? Were
David processing a lot of emotions.
A lot of emotions.
Totally.
And sometimes in and around music, it's been used to help process. And so God has led you to you have such a gift, by the way. It's so cool. So there's 8 songs on here.
9, I think.
9. No, sorry.
Let me double check that. I'm pretty sure. 1, 2.
But it takes you on a journey, is my understanding. Yeah. Tell us a little bit maybe about some of the songs.
So it starts off, the first song is Shipwreck, and the first half of the song is all like, life is lovely and normal and just the way that it has always been, and things are great. And then kind of hits in this ending of just in the space of a heartbeat, chaos erupts. And then echoes some of the language of how everything's been okay to like how everything's broken and chaotic now. And so often that's how death, that's how tragedy, that's how difficult times present themselves. It's not often that we see them coming and we can anticipate it.
Right.
Often it's just like one day everything's good, and then the next it's not all of a sudden. And so then it kind of journeys through shock, through loneliness, through anger, which was actually the hardest song probably for me to write, because I didn't actually experience a lot of anger. I experienced a lot of frustration and like, this isn't fair, but it was more like a sad, this isn't fair. So that was interesting.
Okay.
And then kind of hinges in the song Lighthouse, and this change of like, where there's hope, where there's light, there's hope. And so it's kind of this idea that like, you know, you've been out on the ocean, just like surviving, being like thrown about by the waves, and you don't really have a lot of control, and all of a sudden you like catch a flash, and it's like this lighthouse, and it's like hope, and it's like, look, like keep your focus on that. And then the next song is like, okay, now you got to fight for the land. Like you got to fight to be saved, and for that hope, and for rebuilding. And then ends up at port, which is not like everything's okay now, yay, we're good, we're full circle, but it's like learning how to rebuild, and like learning that things can be okay after grief. And so just kind of that journey of like being lost at sea, and then washing back up on shore.
Very cool. Very cool. So, you know, we've got a few actual CDs here. I know we've had a little bit of fun about this compact disc world.
Physical CDs to hold.
Yeah, so there's that way, but what does that mean? How can they actually get these?
Yeah, so
if this is what they want.
Yeah, you can message me here at the church. Even just message office at Sandwich Baptist, and they can forward it on to me. So yeah, come up to me, and I'd love to give you one. I'll probably have some in the resource centers at both campuses. So if you didn't know, we have a resource center where you can check out books and all kinds of different resources. So I'll probably put it there as well. And then obviously, it's available for anywhere you stream music online, Apple Music, iTunes, Spotify, all those good places.
Nice. Oh, that's fantastic. This will be an encouragement for you, and depending on your life, possibly very much a help, both for you and maybe as you journey with others who are struggling. So you've been really good at sharing your story, being open. We really believe at SBC, like, those stories can be encouraging. Steve was talking recently, you know, from Hebrews, and just the great cloud of witnesses, and their stories can be inspirational, instructional, encouraging, and all. And we're wanting to tell the story of what God is doing in people's lives here at SBC. Maybe just talk a little bit about that.
Totally. I think story is so important. I think there's a reason why most of the Bible is made up of stories, and why even when we're passing down our histories, before we wrote out our histories and had big textbooks, they were oral traditions and they were story, right? And there's a reason why that's a way that we communicate, because it connects to people, it resonates, it can tap into maybe a different emotion. And I think so often people are nervous to share their stories because they don't want to toot their own horn. They don't want to seem like they've got it all together, or that they don't want people to presume that they're the expert, maybe, or maybe they do, and they're afraid that their like pride is going to be the reason that they're sharing their stories. I think there's a lot of reasons why we're hesitant to, but I think it's so important, especially as people in the church and as Christians, to be sharing the story, like not just our own stories too, but the story of the gospel, the story of what God is continuing to do, of his kingdom coming, and God wanting to restore all of creation and all people. And so, I think 1 Corinthians 15, Paul gives a really good example of those three kinds of stories. And I think it's so important for us in edifying and encouraging each other as brothers and sisters, and especially in this time of COVID, where everybody is feeling the weight. And so I think we're all so desperate to hear stories of how God is working, and like even the smallest story of like a conversation that was meaningful, or like an interaction that turned into something more. Like even the smallest stories can bring so much hope and encouragement to each other. And I think it's so important that we don't assume it's going to be someone else's story for us. We look to us and say, okay, what about my story can I share that could encourage someone else?
You know, as you're sharing some of the struggles that we have, maybe sometimes where we hold back, I think another aspect, and maybe you touched on it, but I didn't quite get it, was that our stories are so interconnected with other people's stories, and that sometimes God is working sort of in the midst of that middle spot.
Totally.
And so it's a challenge. We recognize, I guess is what I'm saying, that it is a challenge sometimes to share the story without maybe telling someone else's story.
Yeah.
I'm really big into, it's not my role to tell someone else's story. So that's not what we're looking for. And you may have a story that does interact with someone else's story, but we could tell it in such a way that it doesn't maybe put the spotlight on someone else or tell someone else's story or maybe share some confidence and things like that.
Yeah.
So we're I guess you guys are really conscious of that.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think too, so often we think our story has to involve someone else. And yet I think it's really important for us to be, reviewing or examining our own lives and our days and our hours and just looking for how we saw God's faithfulness. And lots of times it's just in our own things too of I was really worried about this and God was really faithful. And I didn't even notice it in the moment to be thank God. But now I look back and it's so faithful. And that was so true for so much of my story. There was lots of things that maybe in the moment I was wow, I'm really thankful that God has been faithful. But even in the years following, looking back and being oh my goodness, even before Nathan passed away, God was working and preparing and putting things in place to prepare me for that season. And I think so often we miss some of those things because we don't look back and necessarily notice. And
we didn't talk about this before, but just as you're sharing there, I was just reminded, as a preacher, as a worship leader, sometimes our stories are the ones that kind of get out there because we're sharing the interaction of God with us. And back in June, excuse me, I shared about how God, shamefully, how unaware I was within the whole Indigenous world and the schools and all just clueless. And as I shared that story, I didn't think of it as being something that might inspire other people, but I've had so many people come up to me and thank me just for the vulnerability and just the willingness to share how God was working in my life. He's not done, I hope. I hope.
Totally.
But there is an inspiration to that. So, how if people are maybe God's been doing something in their life and they feel like maybe it could be an encouragement, or how do we hear about stories? What's sort of the process there?
That is the trickiest thing, because you said, people don't want to share other people's stories, even if they've been part of them. We want to be careful that, we're doing it in a way that actually is encouraging and isn't yay, look at what you did.
Right.
But we do so desire to share stories. And so, if you we would love to hear from you. If you have a story, big or small, of how God has been working in your life, how God has been faithful to you, please email us at office@sanishbaptist.org. This is a great space to share story. We've really discovered that.
It's been awesome.
Like some stories maybe don't make a whole video because they're small, right?
Sure.
But they're so important still, and these are such great ways to hear the story behind the story and the heart behind the story and really get to know people. And so we would love to have you on a pre-service chat to share what God's been doing in your life, or even just to put in our prayer bulletin that we send out. If we can just be wow, God did this amazing thing. Sometimes our stories are also just praise items. We're very quick to send in our prayer requests of the things that we need or the things that we're concerned about. But let's also be really active in sharing the amazing things that God is doing and really showing that how He's at work. So I think, it's so needed.
Office@sanishbaptist.org. Thanks for being willing to share what God is doing, that it might inspire and encourage us all. Thanks for joining us today.